Welcome in, everyone. We are really glad you could join us today.
Yeah, it's great to have you all here.
So, mentally set your calendars for the first week of March 2026. You're here with us for a new deep dive, and today we're looking at a pretty massive stack of incredibly detailed security and political briefings.
Really dense stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and it's centered entirely on Somalia. And what these documents capture is, well, it's a nation at a massive, almost completely contradictory crossroads.
It really is.
And right off the bat, because the situation between Mogadishu and the regional states is so highly charged, I mean, we're talking about real-world, ongoing political conflicts here.
Right, very sensitive.
Exactly. So our goal today isn't to take a stance on who is right or, who's at fault.
No.
We are relying strictly on this stack of briefings to just map out the realities on the ground, the arguments from all sides, and the sheer complexity of the power dynamics. That way, you can understand exactly what is happening without us endorsing any specific viewpoint.
Right, we're just your guides through the data. And the mission for this deep dive is to unpack a really profound paradox that these sources present.
A paradox, yeah.
We're looking at how a country can simultaneously celebrate what appears to be a historic constitutional milestone, along with some very tangible military victories.
Real wins.
Right, real wins.
Right.
But at the exact same time, they're teetering on the edge of structural collapse and a devastating humanitarian famine.
It's a massive amount of conflicting information to hold in your head at once.
It is. But the briefings give us a really clear framework to break it down.
Okay, so let's start by looking at what the analysts are calling the paradox of March 4th, 2026.
Right.
On paper, if you were just reading the top-line headlines coming out of the Capitol, this was a day of absolute triumph.
A huge deal.
Yeah, the federal parliament in Mogadishu approved a brand new permanent constitution, and this replaces a provisional charter that had been acting as a stopgap measure since 2012.
So a long time coming.
Exactly. You have President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed publicly celebrating, calling it a historic achievement. He said it caps off a grueling 13-year political process.
And this legislative victory isn't happening in a vacuum either.
Right, out in the field.
Yeah, Somali forces working alongside the African Union's Support and Stabilization Mission, which you'll see referred to as AUSOM in these reports.
AUSOM, right. Yes.
Right. They've been making real, tangible gains. They are actively pushing back al-Shabaab and liberating strategic towns down in the lower Shabelle region.
So state authority appears to be expanding. The momentum seems positive.
It does, and here is the catch.
There's always a catch.
Always. The narrative gets incredibly complicated when you dive into the fine print of that March 4th vote.
Because it wasn't just about the Constitution.
No, it wasn't. The parliamentary approval passed by acclamation. You had 222 out of 329 lawmakers voting in favor. But buried right in the excitement of getting a permanent constitution was an amendment. And this amendment extends the mandates of both the president and the lawmakers by 1 full year.
Wow. So in the same breath that they were formalizing the country's foundational laws,
they are effectively delaying the national elections.
the ones originally scheduled for May of 2026.
Exactly. They pushed them back.
And the political fallout to that was immediate. I mean, the opposition didn't just issue polite statements of disagreement.
Not at all.
Major regional players, we're talking Puntland, Jubaland, and now Southwest State,
Yeah.
they stepped up and completely rejected these changes.
Complete rejection.
Yeah. Their core argument is that this entire constitutional process lacked genuine consensus. They view the mandate extension as basically an illegal maneuver.
Right, one that fundamentally alters federal power dynamics.
And does it without proper, inclusive consultation with the regions.
Which is a huge issue. And what makes that political maneuvering even more critical is the backdrop of absolute desperation across the country.
The humanitarian side.
Yes. Because while politicians in the Capitol are locked in this fierce debate over mandate extensions in constitutional terms, the UN is warning of a catastrophic reality on the ground.
That's grim.
By the end of this very month, March 2026, an estimated 6.5 million people are projected to face crisis levels of hunger.
6.5 million. That is roughly a third of the entire Somali population.
It's staggering, and this crisis is being driven by a brutal, compounding combination of severe drought and the ongoing military conflict.
So you have a political crisis that risks fracturing the federal unity, you actually need to sustain those security offensives in Lower Shabelle.
Exactly. Running totally parallel to a humanitarian emergency that undermines long-term resilience. And it creates the exact kind of desperation that extremist groups exploit for recruitment.
It's a staggering juxtaposition of political theater and human suffering.
Yeah.
And, it leads us perfectly into the historical context provided in the briefing.
Because this has happened before.
Right. It highlights a dynamic that reads almost like a script from a political thriller. I mean, there is a profound historical parallel here.
There really is.
I want you to consider a politician who goes to the absolute brink, actually mobilizing armed forces to stop a presidential power grab, only to turn around and execute the exact same maneuver 5 years later.
It's wild. To understand the gravity of the current crisis, the analysts take us back to April of 2021.
Right.
The situation was remarkably similar. Former President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo reached the end of his term.
Okay.
And rather than stepping down or facilitating a timely transition, he attempted to use the parliament to force through a 2-year extension of his mandate.
And the leader of the opposition during that 2021 crisis was none other than the current president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed.
Exactly.
And his response back then wasn't limited to just, political debates or peaceful protests.
No, he actively mobilized.
Yeah, he brought hundreds of heavily armed clan militia fighters straight into the streets of Mogadishu, physically confronting the government security forces just to stop the extension.
And the human cost of that specific standoff was enormous. The resulting violence and the imminent threat of full-scale urban warfare, it forced an estimated 100,000 people to flee Mogadishu in the span of just a single week.
100,000 people displaced in a week.
The capital was paralyzed. Eventually, moderate military officials and various international stakeholders had to step in. They fractured Farmajo's security apparatus and forced him to abandon the extension.
And that retreat paved the way for a peaceful transition of power in 2022.
Which culminated in Hassan Sheikh Mohammed winning the presidency.
Right, so fast forward to March 4th, 2026, and President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, utilizing his current influence over the parliament, executes the very mandate extension he literally took up arms to prevent.
By pushing his term out by a year, he effectively mirrors the actions of his former rival.
The irony is just heavy. The briefing cites a particularly chilling piece of commentary from Cobb TV, which is an independent local network.
What did they say?
They described this move as the, quote, beginning of a plot toward dictatorship, chaos, and bloodshed.
Wow.
Yeah. The broader analytical takeaway here is that by breaking the established constitutional timelines, the president has severely damaged the norm of peaceful political transition.
It sends a dangerous, destabilizing signal.
Exactly. To every political and military actor in the country, it signals that power is ultimately only relinquished through force, or at least the credible threat of overwhelming violence.
And that destruction of political norms raises a critical question about the actual, tangible power the federal government holds today.
Right. How much power do they really have?
Well, the briefing introduces a fascinating, if somewhat tragic, analytical framework to describe the current administration. They call it the hollow presidency.
The hollow presidency. To grasp the weight of that term, the sources draw a direct line back to a very dark period in Somalia's history.
January 1991.
Right. After the overthrow of the longtime authoritarian ruler Siad Barre, the country essentially collapsed into factional warfare.
Complete chaos.
And during that chaos, a man named Ali Mahdi Mohammed was appointed as interim president.
And he held the title. He even had a degree of international recognition.
But his actual physical authority was practically non-existent.
Exactly. His ability to govern was entirely confined to a few small, heavily fortified enclaves in northern Mogadishu.
Enclaves that just happened to be controlled by his specific Abgal subclan.
Right. The rest of the capital was carved up and brutally run by rival warlords. And the rest of the vast country completely ignored his administration.
So he was a president with zero capacity to enforce his decisions, collect taxes, or secure his borders.
And the analysts in our briefing make the compelling argument that the federal government in 2026 is uncomfortably mirroring that 1991 model.
They describe the modern administration as functioning more like a Mogadishu city-state than a true national government.
The evidence they lay out for this is incredibly specific.
It is. If you trace the timeline, the fractures are obvious. Like in March of 2024, the state of Puntland formally withdrew its recognition of the federal government.
Just withdrew it.
Yeah, triggered by Mogadishu making unilateral constitutional amendments without regional consensus. Puntland declared it would operate as an independent government until a mutually agreed upon federal order was restored.
That is a massive, economically vital chunk of the country simply opting out of the national system.
And the economic and diplomatic isolation becomes even more apparent when you look at the events of January 2026.
Right, the port deal.
Yeah. The president in Mogadishu issued a sweeping decree meant to annul all security and port agreements between Somali regional entities and the United Arab Emirates.
This was a direct attempt to assert national sovereignty over major economic hubs.
Specifically targeting the ports in Berbera in Somaliland, Bosaso in Puntland, and Kismayo in Jubaland.
And these aren't just local docks.
No.
They are massive maritime hubs that generate the bulk of the regional revenue.
So what happened? Puntland and Jubaland completely dismissed the decree.
Just ignored it.
They called it null and void, asserting their own constitutional authority to manage their economies.
And the briefing highlights a potent symbol of this impotence.
The flights.
Yes. Fly Dubai commercial flights continued to land in Hargeisa, Somaliland, completely ignoring Mogadishu's airspace decrees.
So it was business as usual, entirely beyond the reach of the central government.
Exactly. And the international dimension of this hollow presidency is perhaps the most striking part.
Because in December of 2025, Israel officially recognized Somaliland.
Which is huge.
The briefings note that this recognition doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is a strategic play by Israel for influence near the critical Red Sea shipping lanes,
Effectively treating Hargeisa as a sovereign, reliable partner.
while completely sidestepping Mogadishu.
It proves that major international actors are perfectly willing to engage directly with regional powers.
Rendering Mogadishu's claims of overarching national sovereignty increasingly rhetorical.
When you add up the ignored decrees, the withdrawn recognition, and the independent foreign policies of the regions,
You have a federal government that does not control its country's borders, cannot dictate terms at its major economic ports, and is bypassed in international security partnerships.
it rules by decree over a territory that simply does not obey.
And this massive disconnect between what Mogadishu decrees and what the regions actually do perfectly explains why the recent constitutional vote is so explosive.
The one that sparked this whole March crisis.
Right, because a major cornerstone of this new permanent constitution is the shift to universal suffrage. It mandates direct voting for members of parliament.
The phrase is one person, one vote.
And to a lot of outside observers and international donors, transitioning away from clan-based selections to direct democracy sounds like a massive leap forward.
It sounds great on paper.
But the briefing reveals why this specific reform is actually one of the most dangerously contentious parts of the whole crisis.
It does sound counterintuitive that people would actively fight against universal suffrage.
Right, why fight democracy?
But the briefings show that the push for direct democracy is perceived as an illusion when you look closely at the reality on the ground. First, there is the sheer logistical and security impossibility of pulling it off.
The documents cite a stark warning from the International Crisis Group issued back in October 2025.
Yes, the ICG made it clear that al-Shabaab still holds firm control over vast rural territories, and they heavily contest many others across the southern and central regions.
So the central government simply does not have the physical security apparatus, the civil registry, or the institutional capacity to safely register millions of voters.
Let alone protect polling stations. Pushing ahead with a national election where massive swaths of the population physically cannot participate because it is too dangerous, that will not legitimize the government.
It will only deepen the violent divisions and disenfranchise entire regions.
Exactly. And beyond the security logistics, you have to understand the clan reality. This is the engine driving the political machinery.
Up until this new constitution, Somalia has utilized what is known as the 4.5 system.
Right, the power-sharing mechanism.
It's a complex clan-based system. It's named for the 4 major Somali clan families, who each get a full share of parliamentary seats and political appointments, while a coalition of smaller minority clans receives a half share.
And it is widely acknowledged as flawed and rigid.
Very rigid.
But it was specifically designed as a stopgap to ensure that every major group felt they had a guaranteed seat at the national table after decades of civil war.
So because of that deeply entrenched history of balancing clan interests, the regional states look at Mogadishu's sudden push for one person, one vote, and they do not see a democratic awakening.
No, they see a Trojan horse.
States like Puntland fear that the central government, which is historically dominated by the Hawaii clan family, which is the clan of President Muhammad, they fear it's using the appealing concept of universal suffrage to systematically override regional autonomy.
Their fear is that a simple popular vote without the guardrails of a clan consensus model would allow the more populous groups located in the South and center to dominate the national agenda.
They view this entire constitutional rewrite as a thinly veiled attempt to centralize power within a system that was explicitly negotiated to be a decentralized federal republic.
So the regions are pushing back with threats of secession and military posturing because they genuinely feel their sovereignty and their guaranteed representation are being erased under the guise of democratic reform.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable but crucial part of this deep dive.
The big question.
Yeah. With all the billions of dollars spent, the decades of international state-building efforts, the constant foreign interventions, why does this exact same cycle keep repeating?
Why is the country perennially on the brink of structural collapse?
Right.
Well, the briefing provides a core analytical insight here that is deeply cynical, yet incredibly clarifying.
It really changes how you look at it.
The experts argue that Somalia is not fragile by accident. The prolonged instability is not simply a failure of policy or a lack of resources.
They call it a deliberately sustained system from which powerful players profit.
A deliberately sustained system.
That concept changes how you view everything we've discussed so far. The chaos isn't a bug in the system. For a specific class of political and military elites, the chaos is the feature.
The briefing breaks down the mechanics of how this fragmented extractive equilibrium actually functions on a day-to-day basis.
Like with taxes.
Yes, exactly. International donors constantly push for a functioning national tax system, but it never materializes because regional political elites deliberately block it.
Because if a unified national tax authority is established, local leaders lose their ability to collect informal taxes. They lose the transit bribes and the massive unregulated revenues from regional ports like Bosaso and Kismayo.
They keep the central state weak so they can preserve their own localized wealth.
And you see the exact same extractive logic applied to the military and security sectors.
Right.
The briefing points out that the creation of a truly robust, unified national army is constantly hindered from within.
Because building a national force with a single chain of command would sever the crucial link between local warlords, clan militias, and regional political power.
For many of these elites, their private clan-based militias are the very foundation of their political influence and economic leverage.
If a federal state suddenly achieves a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, those regional leaders lose their enforcement mechanisms.
It completely reframes the conflict between Mogadishu and the federal member states. You aren't looking at a partnership where leaders are simply disagreeing on administrative policy.
No, you are looking at a zero-sum game.
It is a vicious struggle for scarce resources and political dominance based on institutionalized clan territories.
The federal system, which was supposed to gracefully devolve power after 2012 to prevent another dictatorship, essentially just provided the framework for regional elites to consolidate their own heavily armed fiefdoms.
Fiefdoms that now possess the military and economic capability to directly rival the capital.
And understanding that deliberate fragmentation brings us to the geopolitical outlook. Where is this all heading?
The briefing provides a forecast for the next 6 to 12 months, and it is a sobering read.
They describe the current trajectory as a structural collapse in slow motion.
Rather than a sudden dramatic implosion, the most likely scenario outlined is a steady process of disintegration.
Whether that disintegration is managed through tense negotiations or unmanaged through localized violence remains the critical unknown.
The specific contours of that expected disintegration are fascinating, though. The analysts anticipate that the federal government will continue to operate essentially as that isolated Mogadishu city-state,
presiding over a very loose, highly dysfunctional confederation where decrees are issued but rarely followed.
And Puntland is expected to further solidify its operational independence, building out its own parallel economic and security structures.
Meanwhile, Somaliland will continue its aggressive march toward full international recognition,
leveraging that major breakthrough with Israel to encourage other nations, particularly those concerned with Red Sea security, to engage directly with Hargeisa and bypass Mogadishu entirely.
This situation is a profound, real-time case study in the limits of international state building.
It really is.
It illustrates how formal political frameworks like Newly minted constitutions and internationally recognized central governments can become entirely detached from the actual realities of who controls the ground, the borders, and the economy.
It forces observers to question what sovereignty even means when a national government is routinely bypassed by both its own regional member states and major international actors.
It demonstrates perfectly how the official, internationally recognized map of a country and the functional, on-the-ground map of a country can be two entirely different things.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final, incredibly provocative thread drawn from the very end of the briefing that shifts the perspective entirely.
Yeah, this last detail is fascinating.
We've spent our time looking at the massive fault lines, the huge fractures between the central government in Mogadishu and highly organized massive regions like Puntland and Somaliland.
Right.
But the briefing leaves us with this almost fractal detail about the nature of secession. It mentions the recent emergence of a new Northwest federal state that is actively organizing to challenge Somaliland's authority from within.
On top of that, the analysts note rising anti-secessionist sentiment brewing in the Adal region.
It reveals the ultimate, inescapable paradox of this kind of political fragmentation.
It really does.
It leaves you with a critical question to ponder. If the larger, powerful states are successfully fragmenting away from Mogadishu to establish their own sovereignty, what happens when those breakaway regions start fracturing internally themselves?
In a system fundamentally built on clan sovereignty, informal taxation, and localized militia control, where does the splintering actually stop?
It is a complex, constantly evolving puzzle, and one we will continue to monitor closely. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.